Over the last largely 100 years, the loss of biodiversity throughout the globe has been massive. We are in one of the most biodiversity depleted countries in the world, but UK is not the only one. And every country has to take action. Being able to assess all the information that's coming in year on year is going to be really important. And it's not just the new applications. Every few years, the councils would need to go back and check whether the gains, as promised, have been delivered or not. That is still at least 5 or 6 repeated baselines on every single project site over the 30-year timeline, if not more. Without technology, it's impossible to deliver that. But almost 85% of councils don't even have an ecologist on a payroll. So it makes it very difficult for them to assess the biodiversity applications coming in. Most of them are going to prioritize the most impactful and the largest of the projects and start the scrutiny from there, go down as far as they can.
Hey, Shashin, thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for having me here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm Shashin, VP of EMEA for AiDash. We use satellite images and other data sets to create a product that helps our users measure and improve biodiversity and other natural capital metrics on land.
So biodiversity is increasingly a hot topic. What does biodiversity mean to you?
Yeah, so the way DEFRA has defined biodiversity is by breaking it down into steps that can be taken by the existing set of experts on the ground, which is ecologists. It starts with identifying the kinds of habitats on the ground, classifying them to a fairly thorough and low-level detail in terms of what kind of habitat it is. For example, if it's a grassland, there is a long list of classification of grasslands into which any grassland might fall. And once you've done that, then they have other parameters that they want to be quantified. So for example, there's something called a strategic significance, which can change locally for a given habitat, and a condition of the habitat. Within condition, they have, again, a long list of questionnaire that requires observation that can help towards the quality of the plant life, as well as the presence and quality of the animal life. And that together then gives you score that you can use to then calculate the biodiversity. The idea behind the approach is to be able to take any land within the country and come up with a number which is like a number of units of biodiversity on that land and compare it with any other land elsewhere in the country. And that makes those comparisons really fungible, transferable. So if you have a project site where you want to achieve a biodiversity net gain of 10 units that you're not able to achieve, you can then offset it by buying 10 units equivalent from elsewhere. That's a slight simplification. There are some additional conditions to it, but that's more or less the idea.
So you gave the example there of biodiversity net gain of 10 units, which obviously refers to a target which has been set by the regulator, in which, say, developers have to deliver essentially a 10% improvement in biodiversity within an area. Is that the driver behind this development of the framework?
Yeah, so this framework's been developed in response to Environment Act, which was passed in 2021, which requires all developments to achieve 10% biodiversity net gain over the baseline before the project development started over a period of 30 years. It's like for all the residential and commercial developments, the infrastructure projects will get covered from next year onwards. But to support that, the metrics were needed. There was a standardized mechanism or measurement of biodiversity was required for the country. But what we're finding increasingly is that even other organizations like utilities, which are not covered under Environment Act, but have similar requirements from their own regulators. So water companies have requirements from Ofwat, or energy utilities have requirements from Ofgem on improving biodiversity on their land, which could be a standalone requirement as part of the price review cycles as well. They are also leaning towards using similar metric because it now gives them a standardized way of measuring the biodiversity on the land and then delivering that BNG as promised to the regulator. So the scope has definitely widened beyond just what the Environment Act covers, and this is getting a nationwide adoption from all industries.
So it's clear that industry is now increasingly under pressure to deliver improvements to biodiversity, which is great, but it's bigger than this, right? Is not so developers can meet organizational goals. It's It's greater than that. There's a planetary need.
Yeah.
I mean, we will go into biodiversity net gain and what that means from a private sector perspective in a second, maybe. But why don't we break down maybe what you could call a bit of a sort of biodiversity crisis?
Yeah, I think we can take a step back from the detail of it within England. So this really comes from the COP for biodiversity that's been happening. So the last one was in, if I remember correctly, was in Montreal, where about 90 plus countries signed up to what's known as GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework. UK is one of those countries. For the last 60, 70, largely 100 years, but more in the latter part of it, the loss of biodiversity throughout the globe has been massive. We are in one of the most biodiversity depleted countries in the world, but UK is not the only one. And every country has to take action. UK is taking a lead on it, which is amazing because now we are defining standard that the rest of the world is going to follow. We keep hearing about climate crisis. There was a lot of work that was done around carbon over the last 2 decades. But then we find that increasingly the carbon push has gone into the voluntary side of things, not regulated, so the results are not as impactful. And in biodiversity's case, we're finding that there is a strong regulatory push, which means that the measurements are going to be more accurate. There's going to be more scrutiny to how it is being delivered, and the results are going to be more real as a result. Plans for improving biodiversity are critical to be able to ensure human survival into the future.
What you've just described there is pretty shocking. The scale of biodiversity depletion in the UK. What does that look like, and how have we found ourselves in this situation?
I think that's a difficult question to answer. We've done development over the years. If you see, we're a small island nation. Almost all the land is used for human purposes in some ways. The amount of land that we actually have for residential developments and other construction is quite small. Even in percentage terms, it's quite smaller than some of the other European countries. But at the same time, the amount of land that's dedicated to agriculture, grazing, all of that adds up. And that's where the biodiversity depletion happens as a result. So all the land that's dedicated for, let's say, farming, food production, that has a very limited biodiversity to it because it's either a monoculture, which is farming, or it is further depleted from farming and hence now used for grazing. So you can't even do farming on it as effectively. Otherwise, farming might produce better commercial value out of it. It's just over a period of time that we found ourselves in it. This is how the land use has changed throughout the world. So we're not unique in that perspective. But what's important is that we take notice of it and we act on it, which is the direction steps we are taking now.
How is the industry set up to be able to respond to what you described as a biodiversity crisis?
So it's a big challenge for industry and for the regulatory bodies as well. The way regulations being structured, it requires, so DEFRA and Natural England have set all the standards, but it's really the local councils that have to go out and enforce it and review it, approve it, because everything's going to happen as part of the planning applications, which is where local councils come in. But almost 85% of councils don't even have an ecologist on a payroll. So it makes it very difficult for them to assess the biodiversity applications coming in. As we understand, most of them are going to prioritize the most impactful and the largest of the projects and start the scrutiny from there, go down as far as they can, their bandwidth allows them to. But even there, the struggle is in being able to find the ecologists, use the limited funds they have, and be able to review the applications and then monitor them for 30 years. The industry also is challenged because there are not enough ecologists to be able to deliver. In conversations, we're finding that some of the ecologists are actually refusing biodiversity or BNG work because one, they have enough work elsewhere. And the second issue they're finding is that there is the amount of clarity here and the level of detail they need to provide to be able to create the application statutory metric for their customer, who's the developer, is not enough for them or not clear enough for them to be able to take that work with the confidence that they can deliver it for the budget that they quote. So they're really waiting for it to become more standardized, for others to go ahead and deliver it, create a process around it so that they can then benefit from it and start offering services in the future. So that's artificially further reducing the amount of experts available that the developers can rely on to be able to do the work.
So we have this mammoth challenge ahead of us of trying to actively improve biodiversity here where we are in the UK. But then the way that the industry and really the UK is set up to respond to that is through ecologists within local planning departments. However, the resource level within these local departments is so limited. It seems as though we're almost fit to fail. Are we actually able to deliver our BNG obligations?
So we've done some research on the total number of ecologists in the country. If we just rely on the conventional ways of doing things, then we are probably not set up for success to be able to deliver it, purely given the talent crunch that we have in this area. If you look at how the ecologists would deliver this today, they spend a considerable amount of time on the ground trying to map the sites, which then enables them to go back and then apply the expertise to do the more value added work, which is what they've been hired for. If you give them the right set of technology tools, they can then create their BNG plans much more effectively. It becomes very clear that where an ecologist was able to do one project, in the same time, they can do 5 projects. And you now have talent pool that is able to support the demand. So it's the adoption of technology, which I think is going to be critical.
You spoke about Britain being depleted as a whole, and it's not necessarily like a regional challenge. It seems as though it's a national challenge that we're faced with. Is your thinking that it is still needing to be addressed at a local level?
I think it needs to be done at both the levels. The challenge is massive. If you try and do it nationally in one go, that could be time intensive for the central body and very expensive as well. So decentralizing it, making it responsibility of individual developers, landowners, helps distribute the load and helps make faster progress. Requiring every single development, even the small ones, means that even if it's a smaller area being covered, biodiversity net gain is still being considered there. And then further going beyond that, the requirements also are around achieving the biodiversity net gain locally. So if a project site is not able to deliver the required target themselves, they can procure credits from the market. So it's similar to carbon's regulatory credits, but the additional pressure on them is to be able to procure those credits locally from within the same council area or from within the same national characteristic area, NCAs, which have been defined and the maps are published. That means that if a project is unable to get the gain done themselves, they are still contributing to biodiversity net gain within the local area.
The carbon credit market is pretty controversial in some parts. Is there a risk that BNG credits just becomes a financial instrument for developers, a get out of jail free card? Or is it set up in a way that can genuinely move the needle when it comes to biodiversity?
It certainly looks like that has been, or the lesson from carbon markets has been learned and weaved into the definition of and the requirements of the law. The reason I say that is because if you look at the prices of biodiversity credits, they are quite substantial, they're quite high. There was also some guidance published around how those prices are going to be based on the kind of habitat. So for some of the habitats which are going to be rarer, much more biodiversity rich, or as DEFRA calls them, very high strategic significance, the credits, any loss there is going to be, has to be recovered from a habitat of similar kind and is priced much higher than the more easily available habitats. And that means that if a developer tries to think of it as a jail-free card, it's going to be an expensive one. It's always going to be cheaper to be able to do the gain yourself, whether you are doing it on site or whether the developer is themselves acquiring an off-site and delivering the gain there, which is also permitted.
And you described it briefly there, but just for clarity, are we talking about creating biodiversity, or is it more a case of enhancing existing biodiversity? I'm sure it's a bit of a spectrum, but what tends to be the typical reality?
So the requirements around improving the biodiversity by 10%. Now that can be done by enhancing the habitats that exist. In some cases, the habitats that exist may be because they have depleted from something else, and now it's a habitat of a certain depleted kind which has less biodiversity stored in it. So any attempt to improve it as the existing habitat is not going to give you the right gain, but you have the ability to essentially go back in time and make it the kind of habitat that it may have been in the past with a much better support for biodiversity in it. So in those cases, you can do something called a creation of habitat. So you're essentially replacing what exists with something else that is going to have a higher value.
Here's the thing: I'm not an ecologist, so
Neither am I.
I'm not the expert here. But it sounds as though it's a system which is still in development in some way. And it sounds as though there's a risk that it could potentially be manipulated. Maybe that's me being cynical here, but how accurate and reliable is this approach when the approach to measurement is dependent on a already resource constrained local authority?
Yeah, so like all regulations, there is always a scope for reporting that does not meet the standards or is not built on good quality data. That has always been the case with all kind of regulatory reportings and regulatory requirements. This is no stranger to that. I think the quality of the compliance really depends on the quality of enforcement as well.
Mm.
And for that effect, we do need to make sure that our councils are suitably empowered in there, not just in terms of being able to take the actions, but also be able to decide what actions to take, which begins by being able to measure what's on the ground, being able to compare the developer submissions with a baseline that supports them and their point of view. And then they're able to then decide whether they want to accept it or not. Without that, I think it's going to be initially a bit of a challenge and interesting space to see, as is always the case and has been with financial reporting as well, where the regulations have been active for much longer. It's always when a regulation goes live, we find that the biggest market players are always under more scrutiny. And then once the good behavior there is established, the regulators move on to the rest of the market.
Mm.
So we believe it's not going to be very different from that approach. The councils are already very vocal about monitoring and evaluating the applications coming from the biggest of the developments much more closely. And then from there on, finding a way to go towards the smaller developments. So over the few years, we may see some instances getting reported where some projects would have underreported the biodiversity baseline, but the hope is that as the time progresses, we'll see less and less of that.
And naturally, as technology improves, we can continue to further empower local authorities and put the right types of technology in the hands of the experts. Biodiversity comes down to ecology, but then actually at the core of that, it's data, right? It's about being able to put the right types of data into the hands so people can make more informed decisions.
Yeah, it is ultimately a data challenge. You got it right on the head. So it's about being able to use technology, gather the right data, provide the analysis on it, and allow them to be able to more efficiently review what's coming in, assess, and make a decision. So I think we're going to see significant improvements in the technology that's in the hand of not just the regulators, but in the hand of industry as well. Right now, the measurement itself is a challenge for both of them, but that's just the first stepping stone. After that, monitoring comes in, which is going to be equally important for developers who have to report every year, and for the councils who have to monitor every year, every project that they approve. So being able to use technology for monitoring, for being able to assess all the information that's coming in year on year for the work being done on the sites is going to be really important. And it's not just the new applications. Every few years, the councils would need to go back and check whether the gains, as promised, have been delivered or not. And that would require baselining the site again. Now, that frequency may differ from one area to another, and one council to another, but that is still at least 5 or 6 repeated baselines on every single project site over the 30-year timeline, if not more. So without technology, it's impossible to deliver that. They have to adopt technology, be open to adopt such technologies and use them to be able to gain that information, allow the technology to generate the insights on which they act rather than trying to get all the data manually and then analyze it before and reach to the insights manually. That has to be pushed in the direction of adoption of technology.
It's exactly where we need to head, because to use your sort of phrasing towards the start, this isn't necessarily about biodiversity on its own. This is about life preservation, because which gives us such a pressing reason to act. Shashin, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Likewise, Jack. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.